Before Frank Lucas became one of the most powerful drug traffickers in New York, he was largely invisible. He arrived in Harlem from North Carolina with ambition but no real standing, surrounded by men who already understood the street's unspoken hierarchy. In Harlem, ambition alone meant nothing. Survival depended on who recognized you and who didn't. Bumpy Johnson recognized Frank Lucas. Johnson did not treat Lucas as a close confidant or successor. Instead, he allowed him proximity. That distinction mattered. Lucas observed how Johnson conducted himself: calm, deliberate, rarely emotional. Bumpy spoke little but listened closely. He understood that Harlem functioned on balance, not dominance. Violence was controlled, not constant. Money moved quietly. Respect mattered more than intimidation. Under Bumpy's influence, Lucas learned discipline. He learned that visibility attracted danger, and that long-term power came from patience. Johnson kept tight boundaries between himself and his subordinates. Loyalty was expected, but independence was limited. Everyone had a place, and no one was allowed to forget it. Lucas benefited from this structure. He was protected from immediate threats and given time to learn how Harlem's underground economy actually worked. He saw how Johnson dealt with the Mafia not through submission, but negotiation. He learned that Harlem could not be ruled like other neighborhoods because the community closed ranks when pushed too hard. But Lucas also absorbed something else: ambition. He watched Johnson age. He saw the limits Johnson placed on himself. And quietly, Lucas began to believe those limits were weaknesses. Where Bumpy valued restraint, Lucas imagined expansion. Where Bumpy avoided attention, Lucas believed visibility signaled power. The mentor-protégé relationship was never broken openly. But it was never equal either. Johnson represented control and continuity. Lucas represented impatience and scale. That tension between discipline and ambition would define everything that followed. When Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, Harlem didn't erupt into immediate chaos, but it didn't remain the same either. His death removed a stabilizing force that had quietly managed boundaries between street operators, the Mafia, and law enforcement. The rules Bumpy enforced were informal, but they were deeply understood. Without him, those rules lost their authority. Frank Lucas recognized this vacuum almost immediately. Where others hesitated, Lucas moved. He understood that Harlem's old balance had depended on one man's presence, and now that presence was gone. The Mafia, long accustomed to indirect control through Johnson, pulled back slightly, uncertain how to proceed. Smaller operators tested limits. Violence increased, but unevenly, unpredictably. Lucas stepped into this uncertainty with a different philosophy. He rejected the slow, negotiated approach Bumpy had practiced. Instead, he pursued scale. His heroin operation was built on efficiency and volume. By sourcing directly and undercutting competitors, Lucas expanded rapidly. He no longer sought approval or protection. He relied on money and fear. In the short term, it worked. Lucas became powerful quickly, but that speed carried a cost. Unlike Bumpy, who spread risk through restraint, Lucas centralized it. His organization depended heavily on secrecy and loyalty, but loyalty rooted in profit is fragile. The neighborhood felt the change. Where Bumpy's era had been tense but stable, Lucas' rise introduced volatility. Disputes escalated faster. Alliances shifted. Law enforcement noticed patterns that hadn't existed before. The power vacuum wasn't filled, it was stretched. Frank Lucas believed he was modernizing Harlem's underworld. In reality, he was removing the very buffers that had kept attention away. Bumpy Johnson had understood that power must remain proportional to its environment. Lucas didn't. And in the absence of restraint, pressure began to build from every direction. The exact moment everything changed is difficult to pin down, because the most important event happened quietly. There was no public confrontation, no visible betrayal in the streets. What brought Frank Lucas' empire to the edge was a decision made in private, a phone call whose consequences would ripple outward with astonishing speed. By the early 1970s, pressure was closing in on Lucas from multiple directions. Law enforcement had begun noticing unusually clean heroin distribution patterns. Rivals were losing money too quickly. The Mafia, never fully comfortable with Lucas' independence, had grown suspicious of how fast his operation expanded without oversight. The walls were closing in. Lucas understood this. Faced with the risk of losing everything, he made a calculation. Survival, not loyalty, became the priority. According to later accounts and court records, information began moving in ways it hadn't before. Roots were exposed. Names surfaced. Operations that had once been invisible suddenly became easy to find. That information didn't spread by accident. Whether the call was made directly to authorities, through intermediaries, or through quiet cooperation remains debated. What is not debated is the outcome. Within days, law enforcement action became precise, too precise to be coincidence. Raids targeted the right locations. Arrests focused on the right people. Financial records lined up cleanly. 7 days. That's how long it took for the illusion of control to collapse. The phone call represented more than cooperation, it represented a break from the code Bumpy Johnson had lived by. Johnson believed silence was protection. He believed that once information left your control, it could never be retrieved. Lucas chose differently. In doing so, he didn't just expose rivals, he exposed himself. The network he had built too quickly began unraveling under scrutiny. Associates panicked. Loyalty evaporated. The structure, once feared, proved fragile when pressure was applied. The call didn't end everything immediately, but it started a countdown Lucas could not stop. The collapse of Frank Lucas' empire did not unfold dramatically, it unfolded efficiently. Once the phone call set events in motion, the system Lucas had built began failing at every level. What had appeared organized and powerful from the outside was revealed, under pressure, to be rigid and overexposed. Law enforcement actions became increasingly targeted. Raids hit locations that once seemed untouchable. Couriers disappeared overnight. Financial trails, once carefully hidden, were suddenly visible. The speed of the takedown shocked the streets. It wasn't just that arrests were happening, it was that they were happening correctly. This efficiency exposed a critical weakness in Lucas' organization. It relied on fear rather than trust. Associates knew they were replaceable. Loyalty had been transactional. When pressure arrived, self-preservation took over. Information flowed freely. Silence vanished. Within Harlem, the shift was immediate. The sense of inevitability surrounding Lucas disappeared almost overnight. Where his presence had once inspired caution, it now invited scrutiny. Rivals distanced themselves. Former allies disappeared. The organization unraveled not from external attack alone, but from internal fracture. The Mafia observed this collapse with detachment. Lucas had operated outside their structure, ignoring the traditional boundaries Bumpy Johnson respected. His fall confirmed their long-standing belief that rapid expansion without restraint invited disaster. They did not intervene, not to save him, and not to finish him. Frank Lucas had built an empire designed for growth, not endurance. The streets remembered this lesson. Power gained quickly can vanish just as fast when it lacks foundation. Bumpy Johnson had enforced order through predictability and limits. Lucas removed those limits and paid the price. By the time arrests reached the top of his organization, the empire was already gone. What remained was exposure, testimony, and a reputation permanently altered. The fall wasn't loud. It was final. When the dust settled, Frank Lucas was no longer a kingpin, he was a cautionary tale. The empire that once dominated Harlem collapsed so completely that it left behind no structure to rebuild, no loyalty to reclaim, and no myth to protect him. What remained was accountability. Courtrooms replaced street corners. The same confidence that once made Lucas untouchable now worked against him. Evidence was layered, testimony reinforced, and timelines aligned. The phone call had not simply triggered arrests, it had synchronized them. 1 week had been enough to erase years of power. For Harlem, the damage ran deeper than arrests. Lucas' rise and fall destabilized the delicate balance Bumpy Johnson had spent decades maintaining. Violence spiked temporarily, Trust fractured. The streets had to recalibrate after the chaos Lucas left behind. This was where the contrast between the two men became impossible to ignore. Bumpy Johnson ruled with limits. He understood boundaries between power and restraint, profit and survival. His influence endured because it was measured. Lucas ignored those principles. He chased scale, visibility, and dominance without understanding the cost. The phone call symbolized more than betrayal, it marked a correction. Authorities did not need years to dismantle Lucas' operation. They needed precision. Once exposed, the empire collapsed under its own weight. The speed of the downfall became legendary, whispered across neighborhoods as a warning. Frank Lucas survived prison, but his reputation never recovered. In the underworld, memory is selective, but failure is permanent. He was remembered not for what he built, but for how fast it disappeared. Bumpy Johnson, meanwhile, remained what Lucas never became, a figure tied to structure, order, and legacy. Even in death, Bumpy commanded respect. Lucas, in life, lost it. The lesson echoed long after the arrests ended. Power without discipline does not last. And one phone call can change everything. Time has a way of sorting legends from mistakes. As years passed, Frank Lucas' story became smaller, while Bumpy Johnson's grew heavier with meaning. Not louder, stronger. Where Lucas' name faded into footnotes of excess and collapse, Bumpus remained etched into Harlem's identity. The betrayal did not erase Lucas overnight, but it rewrote how history judged him. He was no longer seen as a successor or student of Bumpy Johnson. He became the man who misunderstood the rules that kept Harlem standing. The man who thought power was measured only in money and fear. Bumpy Johnson had built influence that survived him because it was rooted in order. He negotiated, restrained violence, and understood the consequences of chaos. Even his enemies acknowledged that when Bumpy was in control, the streets were predictable. Dangerous, but stable. Lucas shattered that stability. After the phone call, after the arrests, after the headlines faded, Harlem remembered who had protected it and who had nearly burned it down. Old-timers spoke of Bumpy with a mix of respect and realism. They spoke of Lucas with disappointment. Frank Lucas lived long enough to tell his story, but stories told without honor rarely age well. His words were questioned. His legacy argued. His rise studied, but his fall defined him. Bumpy Johnson never needed to explain himself. His reputation spoke through others, the thousands at his funeral, the alliances that held even after his death, the silence that followed his name in rooms where respect mattered. In the end, the phone call didn't just end an empire, it settled a comparison. One man ruled with discipline and restraint. The other ruled fast and fell faster. History chose which name to remember.